My mother was 12 years old in the Holocaust. She was in hiding with her mother, my grandmother, in a safe house in Budapest. But occasionally they had to go from safe house to safe house to safe house, but that's the way the gig worked. And people clearly saw them. And how did they clearly identify them as Jews? Because I don't know how many of you know, but Jews wore yellow stars. Right? So obviously people who are seeing them are seeing this woman and her child obviously in distress, clearly vulnerable. There's no doubt about that. The number of people who offered them help throughout the years of the German occupation, Budapest, one person. So if you go back to the death march that my father was on, those people who saw my father obviously vulnerable, beyond vulnerable, right? To passively watch and just to observe, I find that to be somewhere between untenable to unacceptable, if not illegal. And then when I extrapolate that, by analogy, if you will, to contemporary society, when I look around and I see clear examples today, for instance, in Europe, I ask myself, are lessons being learned? But what's critical for me is the person standing and watching. And the question that for me is really important is, does that person have not only moral responsibility, but also legal liability for doing something? But the question of legal liability, whether you are interested in going to law school one day, and I hope all of you do, or not, raises a really important legal question. If you see a person in distress, whether it's outside the school, whether it's near your home, wherever it is, if you see a person who is in distress, potentially a victim, potentially somebody who is vulnerable, do you have the legal requirement to provide assistance to that person, even though providing assistance to that person may harm you? And ask yourselves, what's the significance, the cost, the impact of forcing you to provide assistance to another individual? 30 years ago, I went to a Michigan football game. Where you mentioned I go to these stupid games, right? Okay. By the way, it's now fun to go again, right? And I was walking down State Street, and a college student attacked a homeless person. And I was with a friend of mine, not from Greenhills, and we walked by and said, oh, you know, that college kid, pardon my English, is a jackass. Because I absolutely had the ability to call 911, to say something, to have others help, and we just walked by, went about our merry way, went to watch Michigan. Those were the days of Michigan lost, went to see Michigan lose. But think about it long and hard. If you see somebody who's clearly in distress, and a homeless guy is obviously, you know, he's vulnerable, he's a victim, and you say, oh, you know, that's really too bad, you know, stuff happens. I suggest, if you have the ability, first of all, how many of you have cell phones? Everybody has a cell phone, right? I mean, people who are born, they come out of their mother's womb with a cell phone. All it takes is do 911. And I would suggest that the failure to do that, that's a crime. At the end of the day, what is really important for me in the context of this project is trying to articulate what is called the social contract. So I don't know what age here they start talking about stuff like the social contract, but here's what you need to know. We can agree, we can disagree, which is fine. I really believe in the idea of a community, and that we have a responsibility one to the other, whether or not we know one and the other. On the other hand, I can stand up here and give you all these principles about, you know, legality and morality, but the question is, how do we implement the damn thing? It's not enough to say this is what, you know, this is the principle, but how do you go about actually implementing it? And I suggest that not at the age of 8, not at the age of 12, but yes, at the age of 16 plus, you clearly can do something. You all have cell phones. You can act. You can do something that takes you from the mode of passivity to the mode of action, however we want to define action. So when I reflect back on my parents' Holocaust experience, and I begin with this question of how did it happen, I suggest the following. The lack of a community standing up and saying, can't happen. It clearly, that passivity clearly opens the doors and enables awful things to happen. And if you view history wherever, in the United States, Europe, anywhere, it is that failure to act on an individual human level that ultimately facilitates horrors like the Holocaust. And I want to emphasize that while the horrors of the Holocaust are obviously the horrors of the Holocaust, But not to make it as dramatic as it sounds, I turn to each and every one of you and suggest the following. That you all, from my perspective, from the lens of the law, have the absolute obligation to act. If there's one message you take away, is the following. Passivity kills. I can't be clearer than that. Whether you're walking down State Street, whether, God forbid, you are a migrant today in Europe, whether 75 years ago you were in the Holocaust, or if you're walking down the halls here at Greenhills. Always, from my perspective, view this question from the perspective of the victim, of the vulnerable, and the person who's going to be injured. And if you think about it in that context, the idea of imposing a legal obligation on the bystander, at least from my perspective, makes eminent sense, because that's the only way that society can protect the victims.